Director of Publications, Grants, and Operations for Cappella Romana. I'm here with my friend and colleague, Robert Kyr. Robert is the Professor of Composition and Theory at the University of Oregon School of Music, and he also directs the Oregon Bach Festival Composers Symposium, the Music Today Festival, the Pacific Rim Gamelan, and the Vanguard Concert and Series. Robert is a regular collaborator of ours, and as we'll be talking about today, on Friday, November 11th, we will premiere his new choral work, the All-Night Vigil, as part of our 2022-23 concert season. And we will also release our recording of the Vigil on the same day. Robert, thanks so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
Tell me about your work. Tell me about the All-Night Vigil. What was the inspiration for it? What's the background for it?
The background was that for 30 years, I have dreamed of setting the text of the All-Night Vigil, and I wanted to set it in English because the setting of Rachmaninoff is in Church Slavonic, which is such a beautiful language, and it sounds marvelous. But I also felt that there should be an English setting of the entire text that Rachmaninoff chose. Mm-hmm. And I was looking over a 30-year period, and I simply couldn't find a text that had the kind of poetic quality to it that I had hoped for, because, as you know, English can be difficult to set if it's in a version that's too clipped or that has too many hard endings to the words. You don't get the fullness of what one is trying to express. Finally, Father Ephraim Lash created this most beautiful translation, and I was completely inspired. And the rest of it is history. I set to composing the piece shortly thereafter.
Well, Father Ephraim Lash is certainly well known to Cappella Romana's audiences. The 2008 recording, The Divine Liturgy in English, used the Archdiocese of Thyatira translation, which was largely his work. And of course, his translation of Psalm 103 was the basis for the recent Heaven and Earth recording. Can you say more about what in his translation spoke to you and what kind of influence it had on your musical approach?
Yes, the translation was so important to me because, of course, the All-Night Vigil is a resurrection piece. And in the text itself, there are quite a few moments when one needs to enter into the realm of the rapturous, the ecstatic, that quality that sometimes is lacking in some of the settings of parts of the All-Night Vigil. Often, for some reason, I think some composers find it more of a crucifixion piece than a resurrection piece. And I very much was in the spirit of the resurrection aspect of it. And inside of his text, I found that he had been so sensitive to the choice of words that would allow that kind of expression to come through musically. And actually, as I was composing it, even though he passed away shortly before I began composing the work, I felt he was there with me somehow. There was this feeling of co-creating the piece, actually.
Sure.
And I found that to be very inspiring and very beautiful, especially with that theme of renewal and resurrection. There was a kind of feeling of being together.
Sure. My own experience with him was that, he was a wonderful collaborator, and a very generous collaborator, we could say. And he was a dear friend of this ensemble. May his memory be eternal. Can you talk a bit about how the All-Night Vigil fits in with your own artistic and musical journey as a composer?
Yes, it's a very important part of my entire work because it's part of the life unto life cycle. I'm setting the entire life of Christ, the journey of Christ from Annunciation through Ascension and then Pentecost, and all of the different phases of the life in 7 parts. So it starts, the first part is Nativity, and then the second is Baptism and Temptation. The third is Miracles and Transfiguration. The fourth is the Tenebrae, Journey of Shadows. The fifth, 2 passions, one from the perspectives of the evangelists and the other from perspectives of the women. Then the sixth part is an Easter Vigil with All-Night Vigil, 2 different works, again, different perspectives of the story. And then finally, the resurrection and ascension in the final part. And I've created at this point about 90% or a little bit more of the work, and that's all been premiered. So there are just two more parts left, the Ascension Oratorio at the end and the Baptism and Temptation is the second part. But the All-Night Vigil functions within that journey, and it's a very important place because it doesn't recount the life of Christ in the way that the other movements do. It's a kind of portal, if you will, into that final stretch of resurrection. Now the resurrection stories are told at greater length, and many stories that aren't in the All-Night Vigil then come into it. So that final part opens up from the All-Night Vigil and then continues into the Ascension, which is the most rapturous and ecstatic of all the movements, culminating in the Pentecost, when the actual energy of the Christ and Christ's spirit and principle must come back into the earthly realm in order to complete his life's journey, which I think is so important to the story itself.
That's really interesting. I mean, hearing you talk about that, it almost sounds as though what you're saying is that within the liturgical framework, you're finding a way of expressing the inexpressible.
Yes, that's very much part of the aesthetic, in fact, of the entire life unto life cycle from the Annunciation, which has, as you well know, the certain mystical aspects to it. It connects absolutely to the new birth at the end,
Right.
Ascension and Pentecost. There's a complete line, and the themes within the life of Christ are all organically connected in the most incredible way, to think of the history of how it came into being and then was transmitted, and four different gospels, and yet they agree so much of the time. I mean, virtually all of the time. There are some places where things diverge a bit, but that's to be expected. And it's a story that has a human component to it, and people tell stories in different ways and see different meanings in it. So it's not really contradiction as much as it's a kind of greater unity that's made out of the breadth and depth of an experience that is embraced by the Christ Spirit from beginning to end. And I found that very inspiring as I was creating the All-Night Vigil, because I could feel the whole trajectory and movement of Christ's life all the way into the resurrection part, stretching then toward the ascension, that idea that the All-Night Vigil is a portal into that final arc of the journey.
I mean, that sounds just like an amazing cycle of cycles in terms of the full structure that the vigil fits into within your work. That's amazing.
Yeah, and it's very important to me, I must say, that the text be an Orthodox text, and that the life of Christ be celebrated by the whole church, meaning however you might regard it. Of course, we know the history, but this idea that indeed all of humanity is one family. And I think that is espoused in some very critical ways in the Gospels and in the life of Christ. It's this idea of oneness, wholeness, the stewardship of creation as an entity in which all is unified. And I tried to convey that as much as I could through the music by using certain thematic material that runs from beginning to end of the piece, and yet has many different transformations as it goes.
Now, this is not the first time you set Orthodox texts, and you just hinted at it a little bit, but what appeals to you as a composer about Orthodox liturgical texts?
Well, again, I'm going to use that word, ecstatic and rapturous. The nature of the text is often it's so poetic, and has that element which is never really very far from most of the text and in services in the different celebrations throughout the year. Also, I find that there's a profound celebration of the unity of all being and creation that's never lost sight of, being the very best steward of creation that one can be. uh, which also is worked out through the Service of the Environment in September. And
Hmm.
of course, I created a work very much related to that. That was prior to this one, A Time for Life, which was recorded
Yes.
by Capella. And then during the pandemic, I made a film that is created to that recording, um, commissioned by Capella.
Hmm.
And actually, that experience flowed into the All-Night Vigil as well, because that piece celebrates just what I'm talking about and is connected to the same manifestation of that spirit of unity, but now works itself out in different ways, tells a story in another way within the scope of the life of Christ.
Can you talk a bit about how liturgical context and liturgical framework influences how you approach the setting? Because this is, you're setting this as a concert work, but it is a text that has a pragmatic function. And where's the line for you between concert and service as you approach it?
Well, for me, they're all part of one spectrum of music. And again, I wanted to refer through the creation of the work to the fact that it could be performed in concert, it could be performed in various ways in any religion that wants to choose any part of it. It could be done. Either the whole thing, it would depend on, of course, the liturgy, if it were done in a church setting. But not only that, I'll say that the passions that I created, parts of them have been done in Jewish services, have been done in Buddhist practice, have been done in other Baha'i practice, and so forth and so on. Zen practice, part of meditation. So I consider all of the pieces that I've created that would have some kind of resonance in a religious sense to be ecumenical.
Hmm.
I make a point of worshiping with all people, all those who are engaged in practicing a religion or have a practice that is related to love and wisdom, compassion and forgiveness. Those principles
Hmm.
are those that I look for within any practice that I'm celebrating within.
Hmm.
And I hope that that's conveyed through the music and through the life unto life cycle, but in particular through the all-night vigil.
In terms of deciding on how you're going to set the vigil, were there any musical sources that you drew from consciously, certainly, but in going back and hearing it, now that the recording has been made, are there any influences that you hear that you realize you were drawing on unconsciously?
Absolutely. Certainly, chant is present in the entire piece from beginning to end. Sometimes very much in the foreground, sometimes the middle ground, sometimes in the background. Certainly, the connection to the ison or the drone in Byzantine music, that's certainly very much part of the piece from beginning to end, as it is in Rachmaninoff. But also, some of the chants that I've created, which are my own,
Mm-hmm.
uh, do emerge from some of the musical materials that you might hear in the Rachmaninoff, but done very differently. It's part of a different kind of spiritual landscape that's very connected to Rachmaninoff, and yet is exploring some different aspects of the story in a different kind of way, perhaps more aiming toward the ecstatic and rapturous, the joy of the resurrection, and the mystery of
Mm-hmm.
it. And of course, as is referred to in the Gospels, the terror and wonder of those who came to the tomb to find it empty, and then how that affected their lives, and then how they, in this case, the women were given the commission to go out and express this to the followers and the disciples and the apostles.
Now, how did Capella enter the picture in terms of the creation of the all-night vigil?
Well, Capella was always on my mind from the very first note that I wrote, and actually from the very first time I read the text, because first of all, it's one of the great choruses of our day, in my view. In my view, Alexander Lingus is one of the great visionaries of his tradition, without any doubt. And what he's done with Capella and what he's done in partnering with Mark Powell and with the entire leadership of Capella is extraordinary. I wanted to, having created A Time for Life, wanted to create another piece, in this case the All-Night Vigil, that would celebrate a different aspect of the music making of Capella and give everybody a chance to be a soloist as well. There are a lot of soloists that are woven throughout the work from beginning to end. It's about an hour long.
Mm-hmm.
And the collaboration then was a really complete one between the soloists and between those who are singing in smaller groups of trios or one on a part or full chorus singing, which is something that Capella does so well.
Mm-hmm.
So many of the choristers are also soloists and are also incredible vocal chamber musicians.
Mm-hmm.
So what a joy for us to collaborate again. It really, I have to say, has been one of the high points, not only of my musical career, but of my entire life. There was just something so inspiring to me throughout the time during the summer when we recorded the piece, the rehearsals, and then the recording, and then the celebrations that we had as we finished. I'll really never forget it. It's very much part of me now and part of any work that I'll write from here on.
Say more about the recording process. Tell me what that was like to sit in the booth and hear a producer and a conductor sort of coach Cappella Romana through putting all of your work down on tape.
I thought the process was, again, it was extraordinary because I felt that Alex Lingus knew my piece as well, if not better, than I did. He had really gone to the inner life of the work and was able to conduct it from the inside out, which for me is always the most profound way that a conductor can get to know a work from the inside, from the inner life of the text, of the music, and then to live it out and to be able to convey that to all of the singers in the chorus in a way that from the first rehearsal they're connected to the work in a primary way. Often it can be far from that. I mean, it depends on the chorus and the conductor. Sometimes choruses don't really connect with the work until fairly late in the process. Mm-hmm. That makes finding the ideal interpretation very difficult. Mm-hmm. Not with Capella. It's from that first rehearsal that they're already inside of the work and creating it and co-creating it with the composer inside. And that, again, was part of it, just such a great joy of the whole collaboration. I love the recording process. And in this case, so great to do it before we did the live premiere.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it sounds like you're excited, and I would think everybody else is excited to actually bring the live premiere to audiences and to let audiences actually hear it. What do you hope above all audiences will take from this piece?
I hope that they will take a spirit of hope, of joy, of possibility, of renewal from the work. It's created with that spiritual purpose, is to invite the listener into that state of consciousness, to make that state of consciousness part of one's own focus, especially in these times where we're living in one of the most momentous times in human history. Obviously, the pandemic has been a very important part of that. We wish it never happened, but it did. And so many people used it in a way to reflect on their life and what they wanted to do and where they wanted to go, because eventually we would emerge from it. And I think that because the work was at least in part composed during that period, that was part of my intent as well, asking, okay, when we emerge from this, just as in the story, there's a crucifixion that leads to resurrection and ascension eventually. Will we also be able to be part of that journey? Will we consciously enter into a spirit of renewal, hope, let go of some of those divisions in society that are so difficult for us now, let go of some of the animosities in the world that are at the root of war and strife, and become the fullness of human beings that we were intended to be, that we were created to be.
Mm-hmm.
Focus on what is right instead of trying to build society and build on all of the difficult things we see around us. Because when we rest in that kind of consciousness, we sink. But with hope and renewal and a spirit of joy, we rise. And that's the whole message of the All-Night Vigil. At least one of the streams of meaning that one can find in the text, and I hope in my music that I've co-created with the text.